Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Policy Indicators training session for the 1,000 Cities Challenge. Thank you very much for joining this session. We're running two of these sessions in different time zones. This is the first of our sessions, and it's a pleasure to have you along for this training. And I'll be co-facilitating the session today. So my name is Dr. Melanie Lowe, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm also the co-director of the Global Observatory of Healthy and Sustainable Cities, which is hosting the 1,000 Cities Challenge. Deepti, did you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Melanie. Hi, everyone. My name is Deepti Adlaka. I'm an associate professor of urban health at the Delft University of Technology, and I'm co-leading the development of policy indicators with Melanie.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Deepti, for co-facilitating this session. And we will be sort of both taking you through different parts of the training today. Maybe in the chat, if you'd like the participants to introduce yourselves, maybe just mentioning your name if it's not on your Zoom profile, and your organisation and perhaps the city that you're from. That would be great, so that everyone can get a bit of a sense who's on the call today. Working out how the slides progress. Here we go. So before we get into the session, I did want to do some acknowledgements. Firstly, and importantly, to the Executive Committee of the 1,000 Cities Challenge for their leadership of the project overall, but also to the Policy Indicators Working Group, which is a team that have been working diligently to help us to refine and develop the policy indicator checklist that we'll be going through and doing the training on today. So what will the session involve? Well, the key purpose of the session is for you to learn how to collect policy data for your city and to use the 1,000 Cities Challenge indicators to assess whether the policies for your city support urban health and sustainability. So I'm going to begin by providing a bit of an introduction to the 1,000 Cities Challenge policy indicators, particularly for people who perhaps haven't attended our webinars in the past or are new to the 1,000 Cities Challenge. Then I'll hand over to Deepti, who will go through how to get started with the policy checklist. Back to me, so we'll go through some explanation, but also I'll demonstrate how to find policy documents and to fill in the policy checklist. And then Deepti will facilitate some questions and answers at the end. So we do want to have that time for questions and answers overall. But the session is designed to be interactive. So we encourage you to participate in the discussion topics that we have throughout the session. And we'll also feel free to post your questions either by raising your hand or posting your questions in the Q&A box. So you'll see that we've got both a chat box and a Q&A box for this session. We'll be using the chat box mostly for our discussion topics and people introducing themselves and that sort of thing. But if you've actually got a question that you'd like Deepti and I to address as we go through, if you could post that in the Q&A box, that'd be great. Now, if you get confused, no worries, but that would just make that a little bit clearer and easier for us to monitor. So the Global Observatory of Healthy and Sustainable Cities, it provides comparable and evidence-based spatial and policy indicator data on the health and sustainability of built environments. And currently the Global Observatory includes indicator reports and scorecards for 25 cities spread right across the globe. And the 1,000 Cities Challenge is really about us sharing open source methods and tools that anyone can use to assess their city. So in this way, we're really upscaling the Global Observatory to include as many cities as possible. So by participating in this challenge, and you obviously demonstrate that you're really keen to participate, coming along to the training today, you'll be able to generate an indicator report for your city and have that added to the Global Observatory of Healthy and Sustainable Cities. But also really importantly, you join our global network of collaborators. And for clarification, the 1,000 Cities Challenge includes two different types of indicators. So we have the policy indicators, which are the focus of our training session today. We also have spatial indicators of urban design and transport features. And so what you can do is choose to generate the spatial indicators alongside the policy indicators, or just to focus on the policy indicators. That's also perfectly fine. And so there is, I'll just direct your attention to the fact that there are training and resources available for the spatial indicators on the Global Observatory website, and you can look at those in your own time. So the open access tools that we've developed for the policy indicator component of this 1,000 Cities Challenge is an easy to use policy checklist, which will help you and potentially your team, if you're part of a group, to assess whether your city has the right policies in place, so the policy presence, and also the quality of those policies in terms of whether they will likely lead to healthy and sustainable urban outcomes. And so you can see just a screenshot of that checklist here, which we'll be going through in a lot more detail in this session. And the 1,000 Cities Challenge policy indicators are a comprehensive suite of measures that are based on evidence, and the particular sort of domains that are shown here on the slide originate from last year's Lancet Global Health series on urban design, transport and health. And so they cover everything from integrated land use and transport planning to air pollution controls in land use and transport systems, destination accessibility by public transport, the distribution of employment, demand management, particularly around driving cars, a whole range of urban design features, housing density requirements, the distance to public transport, which we know is a key determinant of health, transport investment by governments in the different modes, disaster mitigation, the desirability of urban environments for walkability, the diversity of land uses, and destination proximity. Now you can see from that list here on this slide that you'll be really looking at policies across a broad range of sectors or domains in the policy checklist to assess the policy indicators. So it gives you a sense of the breadth of the undertaking. So I'm now going to pass over to Deepti after that brief introduction to what this is all about. Deepti will now talk us through how to actually get started with the policy checklist. I'll stop sharing and we're going to switch.
Sure. Thank you, Melanie. So I'm going to get started. There we go. So hopefully you can see that. What I'm going to do, following on from what Melanie just discussed, is walk you through a step-by-step process of how we work with the policy checklist, what are the various steps involved in data collection, data entry, and then a brief summary of how we are going to proceed after we've collected that data. So to get started, right on your screen, you see the website. So I'd encourage all of you to open that up. It's healthysustainablecities.org/resources. So to demonstrate, I'll just click on that and show you where to scroll and download it. So if you can not see my screen, just unmute and let me know, but hopefully this is working. So on the browser, when you open the web page, you scroll down. If you're interested, there are 2 other webinars that we've linked here. Our past webinars giving you an overview of the 1,000 Cities Challenge. Right at the bottom, you see the policy indicator checklist. You click on that and then save it on your desktop. So for purposes of this webinar, I've already saved it and downloaded it. So we'll go through the steps. So step 1 involves identifying the right people to collect the policy data, which is all of you on the call today. We encourage all of you to be involved and start entering data for your respective regions. You could also work with, if you're in academia or at a university, you could work with students, potentially a master's student, a PhD candidate, a postdoctoral researcher. We also encourage collaboration with practice and government agencies. So there might be colleagues in your network that you may have to reach out to also help with data collection. And step 2 is identifying the relevant policy documents and finding and entering these details into the checklist. I'm going to switch over to the collections tab in the checklist in a minute, but this is just a brief outline of the steps involved, and we'll go through that checklist in detail in a minute. What I'd particularly like to draw your attention to is that we encourage attention to all levels of government. The checklist can be applied to any jurisdiction, whether it's local, metropolitan, regional, and national government. And our aim is to include the whole metropolitan area of the city wherever possible. So we encourage all of you to apply the checklist to the whole metropolitan area, or whatever affects the majority of the people living in the metropolitan area. However, we realize that there may be certain exceptions, and if you are only assessing a smaller administrative unit, say it could be a municipality within a very large city, and you may have certain limitations with contributing data for the whole area, then we have a box where you can notate this in the collections tab and explain why. So with that, I'll switch over to the checklist. So hopefully all of you were able to download that. I'd like to draw your attention to this instructions tab at first. That's the first tab on our checklist where we go through each of those steps in detail. So I briefly outlined step 1, and we'll go through step 2 as well now, and the collections tab. So as I mentioned, we encourage you to apply it for the whole metropolitan area. And down here, we also have details on how to complete the checklist if you need more space, how to insert more rows and things like that. And then we have step 3 and 4, which will come later in our presentation today. So we'll switch over to the collection details tab. As an example, I filled this out for the city where I currently live, which is Delft in the province of Holland in the Netherlands. So as you'll see here, with the levels of government, what I am interested in doing is filling out the checklist for the national government, which is the government of Netherlands, the region, which is the province of Holland, and the local scale is the municipality of Delft. This box here is where we allow for other comments. So if you do not have the capacity or you have certain limitations to add data for, let's say, the national level or the regional level, this is the place where you will notate that. I've entered not applicable here since I'm assessing all scales in this particular example. We also here encourage you to read and apply and enter details about which environmental disasters your city is likely to face over the next 5 to 10 years. And we're doing this because we have a disaster mitigation indicator later on, as Melanie will demonstrate. So we encourage you to fill this out in as much detail as possible. We also have a box here which specifies other. So as you can see in this example, flooding, heat waves are the most commonly experienced disasters in the Netherlands. And in the future, there might be droughts and poor air quality. And then I've also entered some which are unclear at the moment. So this is a brief overview of the first 2 tabs. I'll pause here and we'd like to switch over to a little bit of discussion. We encourage you to pop it in the chat or even unmute and speak up if you'd like to. We're interested in understanding which city you're going to be assessing and what levels of government policy you will analyze for your city and why. And Melanie, feel free to chime in if you want to add any.
Yeah, sure. The only thing I was just going to clarify that if you end up because of your circumstances, either because of the context for your city, or perhaps you're assessing a particular level of government because that's where you work, or you're a researcher partnering with a particular level of government, and that is not the whole metropolitan scale, your analysis can still be included in the global observatory. And that's a little bit of a shift from we've had a bit of a change in policy around that, but we still do encourage wherever possible the inclusion of the whole city. And the key reason for that is so that we can do international comparisons as best as possible. So if we've got local governments over here and then other cities have assessed the whole metropolitan region, it is harder to make those comparisons, and that is one thing that we try to offer in our reporting. So that explains why we encourage assessment of not just the the sub-regions, but whichever levels of government are for the whole region. So that might be a metropolitan government, a regional government, or a national government typically, but that depends on the circumstances. So we've got someone who's going to be doing some collection of data for Santiago in Chile. Great. Maybe does everyone want to, thank you very much for introductions in the chat. If you, perhaps in answer to the first question, that could be put in the chat, you know, which city are you going to be assessing? We might have been able to get that from your introduction if it's your home city, but maybe you're assessing more than one place, or you're interested in assessing somewhere else. So please, you know, type away in that chat. Or Brisbane, Ipswich and Toowoomba. Excellent. In Queensland, Australia. We should be in touch because, of course, I'm based in Australia. Porto, thank you very much, Maria. And I think it might be that you want to post in the chat for the second question there, which levels of government, and some people have already done that, saying local government level in Brisbane, Ipswich and Toowoomba. But also, don't be shy, raise your hand, tell us which levels of government you're thinking of assessing, and particularly if you've got any questions at this point about, I'm actually not sure which level of government I should assess. Raise your hand and we'll have a chat.
Yeah, we'd like to make this as interactive as possible. We have time even at the end for Q&A, so we hope we can actually have a really good discussion with all of you.
So I assume everyone can see the chat there. So some people are assessing multiple levels of government, which is often the case, I have to say, in cities. So Deepti and I have been leading this policy work now for a number of years, and coordinated the collection of data for our first 25 cities. And I would say almost all cities, when you look at the metropolitan scale, had more than one level of government that was applicable or relevant, which does add to the complexity of the task. But I can see that some are more interested in assessing the local government level, and that's okay. I'm really enjoying the fact that we've got people on the call from all sorts of different continents, regions of the world.
Which is also great because it gives that international diversity and comparison and really underscores the goals of our global observatory.
So anyone want to raise their hand and ask a question about the levels of government that they should be assessing or would like to assess for the 1,000 Cities Challenge? Keep posting those comments in the chat as you'd like. But if no one has a question, we might move on. Deep, do you think,
Sure, yeah.
to next part?
So I'll switch over to you, Melanie, and to get started.
Great. Yep. Just excuse me while I catch up with the slides. Okay, so the next part of the session, I want to provide an overview of the policy checklist that you can see the screenshot here, but also do more of a deeper dive or look at the policy checklist and how you might go about filling it in. So Deepti has outlined and provided examples of, so she's outlined the instructions tab is there for all of the information you need on how to fill this in after the session. Then the collection details tab is there. And then this is the third tab in on the Excel spreadsheet. So this is the policy checklist, and this is where this table is effectively where you'll be spending the most time entering the policy data for your city. So I want to just provide a brief overview of how this is structured. So up in the top left-hand side of the policy checklist, we see here the indicators and the broad category of indicators that I've shown on this slide as an example. Now, the checklist is quite long. If you've managed to download it and you've got it in front of you, feel free to scroll down and see, what it all involves. But this category of indicators that I'm showing here as an example is healthy and walkable cities policy. Now, under that category, there are a whole range of different indicators. So we can see here I'm showing the density indicator. And then next column in is the measures. And the measures are really the specific ways that the indicator can be broken down and actually measured. And then the next column in is the principles column, which asks, is the policy aligned with the principles of healthy and sustainable cities? And here we have the option of selecting, yes, the policy content is aligned with the principles of healthy and sustainable cities and for the particular reasons, or no, it doesn't align with those principles. And then the columns to the right of the checklist, if you have found a relevant policy for a particular principle or row, this is where you add the actual details of that policy and provide information on the content of that policy. So the first step for filling in the checklist is actually finding the relevant policy documents. So data collection for the 1,000 Cities Challenge will require you to identify multiple documents. So urban and transport, they might be strategic policies, they might be guidelines, so transport or land use guidelines. They might be regulations or legislative documents, so a whole range of different types of policies. And they might come from multiple different levels of government, as we've discussed. You may be assessing multiple levels of government at the metropolitan scale, or it might be that they just come from multiple departments within a single level of government. So there is that little bit of complexity there, and it's hard for us to say, look, this is exactly how to find the policy documents for your city, because it does vary widely depending on the context. My tip would be to use the indicators in the checklist, but particularly the measures are probably most useful here as a guide for searching for relevant documents, because these, I suppose, categories of indicators and measures will help you actually know what types of documents you're looking for. So here I've got the example, we've got a design indicator. Well, that already tells you might be looking for an urban design guideline or a strategic metropolitan plan that will have aspects of urban design in it. But also we know that we're looking for a policy that includes content around street connectivity and pedestrian infrastructure requirements. So when you read pedestrian infrastructure, you think, oh, maybe it's a transport policy. So it helps to guide the sort of documents that you might be looking for. And you might use a combination of the three approaches that I've got on this slide to find the relevant documents. So firstly, using your existing knowledge of current urban policies, guidelines, or other types of policy documents for your city. And this is where it's really important or useful that either yourself or the person who's collecting the policy data for your city does have that reasonably good local knowledge of what policies are out there, which ones are the key ones. Another complementary approach is to check that you haven't missed anything that might be out there, is to sort of browse through government websites, but also maybe do some more targeted searching of government websites or indeed policy repositories. And particularly when you're searching government websites, to use keywords from the policy checklist and relevant synonyms that are relevant for your city and language context as the search terms is a key tip. So an example of a policy repository that might be worth searching is shown on the slide. For Australia, we have a repository that collects all of the relevant policies for the whole country, and so that would be actually worth looking at. And maybe it's worth checking whether your city or your country has something similar to help with identifying the relevant documents. And lastly, again, complementing the first two approaches, use your networks and connections. So you may seek advice from government policymakers, and that's particularly relevant if you yourself are not within government. So people working in the levels of government that you're assessing are going to have the most intimate knowledge of what are the current and most useful government documents, and make sure that you haven't missed anything. And I also just at this point wanted to emphasise that we're looking for assessment of current urban policies and guidelines. Sometimes it can be policies can actually have been developed quite a while ago, but as long as they're current at the time of analysis and they haven't been superseded, they're relevant for the indicators. So again, a moment of pause for us to have some discussion and also for you to ask any questions that might have arisen so far. But in particular, thinking about your city, what are the best ways of finding policy documents? You know, I'd be particularly interested in any feedback about whether policies are actually likely to be publicly available on websites, or are they, you know, harder to find? Are they mostly in printed paper copies? In some contexts, that can be the case. So what will be the best approaches for your city? I've got to catch up with the chat there. Have I missed any questions as we've come along?
No, I don't see anything yet. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. So we'd encourage you to just think about even a starting point of whether there is a city government website that you would start exploring, or a key contact maybe in the local government that you might reach out to, and just start brainstorming ways that you can get started. Yeah, we have one comment that says online and from the Planning Institute, which has government background. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually one thing that I hadn't thought about, which is going to like Planning Institute or other professional bodies that may be able to provide advice on which documents are most relevant. I also, based on, again, my own experience and reflections collecting this type of policy data, is that sometimes there's the key documents that, you know, you sort of know about, but there might be gaps in you know, particular measures, and you really want to know that you haven't missed anything. And that can be where doing the checking with someone who's you know, better informed, like a government policymaker or a practitioner in the field, can be really useful to make sure that if you're actually saying no, there's not a policy for that, that you're actually really sure that there's not one, that it's not just that you haven't missed it, if that makes sense. Anyone? Don't be shy. Ask us a question. Post us a comment. Just pop your hand up. So we've got a question from Vincent. What if a policy is in draft form or seeking input from the public? Now, that's a very good question. I would say don't include it. If it's almost about to be adopted, it might be worth just, you know, delaying your analysis so you can include it. But for consistency, we would say if something is under development but not yet finalised, it probably doesn't meet the criteria of actually yet adopted. Is that, would you agree, Deepti?
Yeah, I think what we want to see is policies that are very, very close to being implemented, or those that are already under implementation, because we really want to assess the real world impact of those policies. Okay, we have a question, a comment. In Porto, some documents will be publicly available, but we need to improve our connections with people in the local government. Yeah, and improve connections between academia and government. Yes, that's a good point. Part of this is also collaborating and bridging the gap between what we do in universities and research, and also applying it with government leaders.
And hopefully this challenge can provide some structure for you if you're, you know, in that boat where maybe you're in research or outside of practice, that this provides an impetus for getting in touch with and building those connections across those sectoral divides. All right, again, I'll proceed on, but make sure you do post us any questions or comments into the chat as we go. We'll keep monitoring. So filling in the policy checklist. Now, for each measure, those columns to the right they ask for a series of information. Firstly, for each principle, so for each row, is there a relevant policy? And if yes, what is the relevant policy wording or content? And then, is the policy mandatory or legally required? And this is really important because that has implications for the extent to which it's likely to be fully implemented. Does the policy include a measurable target which will help to monitor progress on that implementation and hold the people in charge of implementing it to account? And lastly, is that measurable target an evidence-informed threshold? And here we're looking for, is the target consistent with reasonably well-established or firmly established evidence on what is required to create healthy and sustainable built environments? So to fill in the checklist, you'll need to delve into the policy documents and look at its content and extract relevant information and detail. So how do you actually go about that? And people on the call might have other ideas, but just providing a few tips here. So documents can be very long. Some pieces of legislation, Transport Act, or a metropolitan strategic plan, they can be 100 or more pages, and it may not be practical to actually read every word of that document. So hopefully that is not what is required here. And so, by all means, if you want to be, really thorough, you could read all the way through. But ideas for more quickly finding the relevant content that relates to each measure and each principle include looking at the table of contents as a starting point. So you actually might find the specific relevant sections. So say you're interested in looking specifically at public transport in a broader transport policy, you could just go directly to the section on public transport, which might require fewer pages to be read and looked at. Another key way is to do actually direct keyword searching using Control F or some other method to actually search for keywords and find the content. And here, I would encourage you to use the keywords from the policy checklist. The measures will be useful, but also some of the keywords that you see in the principles will be really useful. And noting that it might be relevant to think about a range of different synonyms. That we in Australia, we might use the term street connectivity, but maybe that's not really the terminology that your city or your country uses, particularly thinking about translation into other languages. So making sure that you're making a locally relevant list of synonyms for some of these key concepts so you can actually make sure that you're finding the relevant context. So I want to go through some examples now in, hopefully leaving us plenty of time for some questions at the end. So just excuse me while I switch over to the policy checklist. Can everyone see the checklist there? Let me know if you can't. So here it is, the policy checklist tab. And the first thing I wanted to draw your attention to is that at the top of the checklist, there is an example provided in the checklist. And so that could be really useful for just, checking how do you actually fill it in. And I'll go through some examples of actually, how you do that in a moment. And the other thing to note is that the checklist is obviously in English, and we do ask that if you're working in a language other than English, that you provide, the best possible English translation for this exercise. When we report back on the indicators, we have for the first 25 cities developed local language reports. So there's the opportunity for us to do the analysis and that work in English, but also to provide a local language versions of reporting if and where that is required. So if you're assessing more than one level of government, include all of the policies in the one checklist for simplicity. There can be more than one policy that is actually relevant to each principle, and that's where you would add a new row to give yourself more space to add those indicators, and I'll go through an example of how to do that in a moment. So the first example I was going to share is this first one. I've just highlighted the rows to make sure that it grabs my attention so I know where I'm at in the checklist. And the first one is here. So it's the indicator around integrated transport and land use planning. And the measure is transport and planning combined in one government department, which can be a key indicator or sign that those sectors are well aligned. So this item is a little different to other items in the checklist because of the nature of the question about sort of really a governance structure question. So I wanted to demonstrate this. It's a simple yes/no checklist item here. So if I was completing this for my own home city of Melbourne in Australia, I would say yes, and then I would select which level of government. In this case, it's state government. And because I may also be assessing another level of government, the state level of government in my context is most relevant to the metropolitan scale, but I might write in the other notes or other information or notes column an explanation that the national level of government is has the two departments, the transport and planning, are separated. So that's where the other information or notes is your opportunity to provide any other useful information that you think will be relevant. So you might say something like national government has separate departments. So that one, that row or that principle is a little different to some of the others. But if I scroll down, and the next example I want to provide is for the density indicator. And this time, the example I'm going to use is from Adelaide, again in Australia, but this is in a different state, the state government of South Australia. And if I knew that the major strategy for the metropolitan area of Adelaide is the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide, I might find and download that document and look and see whether it has relevant content related to, in this case, housing density. So here it is, the PDF. I've downloaded it and having a bit of a look, and I'm interested in whether this document has anything related to density. So I'm going to use Control F here to bring up the search or find function, and I'm just going to type densities and see what I come up with. So there is obviously some content that mentions the word density here. So if I scroll through, quickly go, no, that's not relevant, that's not relevant. Here we have a statement in this policy that specifically is about housing density. So to increase the average gross densities of development within activity centres and transit corridor catchments from 15 to 25 dwellings per hectare to a target of 35 dwellings per hectare. So that's highly relevant information. So while I'm here, I'm going to copy that information back to our checklist. So that particular policy content relates to a minimum housing density requirement. So just make that a little larger for your screens. So really, it is firmly in this particular principle. And so I start by entering the policy name. So what have we got? It's the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide. Next column is the level of government. So that is the state government in this instance, and the year of adoption was 2017. This is where you can provide the full citation for the policy, but I'm just going to provide a false URL. This is where I actually copy the relevant text and provide the page number. So we're really asking for, a direct quote from the text. In English language, that can be simply copy and paste. And if you have to translate that, you just do your best to do so here. So it's page 42 that I found this relevant information. I'll just I'm going to use this box at the top just because it's a little easier to copy and paste information. Okay, so there's the relevant text from the policy directly in that box. Is the policy mandatory or legally required is the next question. There's a drop-down box here. So this one is not, it's just a strategic document. It's not a mandatory regulation or legislation. And then the next question is, does the policy include a measurable target? Again, we've got drop-down options of yes, no, or unclear. Now, it might be unclear for various reasons, and you can explain that in the comments box or the other information box to the far right. But in this case, yes, it does include a measurable target. The content that I've already copy and pasted is very much in that category of sort of a quantifiable measure about a target of 35 dwellings per hectare. We could measure and monitor that over time. So I copy and paste that same wording here because in this case, it's not like it was just a small part of what I previously provided. It's the full content. And then the next question across here, is that measurable target an evidence-informed threshold? Now, these green cells here indicate that there is policy guidance available for what the established evidence might be. There is many areas where it's difficult to say that there is established evidence, but where we've been able to provide it, you'll see the cells highlighted in green. So here, it might be a little hard for you to see on your screens, but there is guidance on established evidence of density minimums. At least 25 dwellings per hectare is required to support walkability. So remember that our target here for Adelaide is 35 dwellings per hectare. So that is, in fact, we would answer yes, this is an evidence-informed threshold, and we type something like this target is above the 25 dwellings per hectare required, or something similar. To explain here, this is your opportunity to explain, this seems to be health promoting based on my experience in practice. That would also be something you could say if there's not that established sort of research evidence, or the opportunity for you to explain in where it's not evidence-based, maybe it lacks ambition or whatever, you can explain that too. Is there any questions at that point? Or I've got one more quick example I can go through. Deepti, I think we've got time for that last example, don't you think? I'll just keep going down.
I think keep going
down.
Last
example.
Sorry,
so the last example. Sorry, you go.
I was going to say we have a few comments, but we can circle back to that, so that's fine.
Okay, sure. So down here, this is a different indicator design, and here we're looking at the measure street connectivity requirements. And I've actually pre-filled here some information from Chennai in India to use quite a different example. And so we can imagine that I knew that this Chennai non-motorised transport policy was a key document for transport planning in Chennai. So I downloaded that, and I found that there was relevant information that aligned with the principles of healthy and sustainable cities, particularly in relation to the maximum size of street blocks. And here, listed under other, I've entered the policy details around prohibiting pedestrian cul-de-sacs, because that reduces the connectivity through neighbourhoods and is not good for walkability. So the fact that they're prohibiting the pedestrian cul-de-sacs is good. And as I did for the Adelaide example above, I've just followed those rows along after entering the policy details. Is the policy mandatory or legally required? No, and so on and so forth. So one of these was a measurable target and one of them not. But I want to know, say, whether this policy includes any other information related to street connectivity. does it include anything, for example, around this measure, around intersection density or the number of intersections per area? So what I would do here, again, I've pre-downloaded this particular policy for the Corporation of Chennai, which is the metropolitan government. And there's the opportunity here to search particularly for any policy content around intersections, because I'm interested in intersection density. So I'm going to put, again, Control F to bring up the search function. And if I search for intersections, let's see what we come up with. And again, quickly scrolling through, I'm familiar with this policy, so I don't need to spend too much time. I've found some relevant content here. The pedestrian network should have at least 80 intersections per square kilometre. Now that directly relates to the content that we're interested in for this particular principle and this measure around street connectivity. So if I go back to our checklist, what I really need to check is, does this align with the evidence on street connectivity? So I could even come over, before I even enter the policy details, I could come over and hover on this guidance that's provided. And we know from the recent study that you need a minimum of 100 intersections per square kilometre to best optimise walkability. So this target of 80 intersections per square kilometre is good, but it lacks a little ambition that would be required to make it aligned with the evidence on healthy and sustainable cities. So really, we can't enter it here. We have to go down to the no ones. And here we have requirements for street intersection density, make street connectivity too low for walkability. And this is actually where we would therefore enter this policy. So I literally can copy and paste the same details as above. Metropolitan level of government, the year was 2014, same URL. And I can copy the relevant policy text here. So found this on page 12. Let's copy that into there. So the pedestrian network should have at least 80 intersections per square kilometre. This policy is not mandatory. Does the policy include a measurable target? That is itself a measurable target. So we would say yes, and copy again that same policy text in here. The time efficiency, I won't do that now. But then when it comes to if yes, is the measurable target an evidence-informed threshold, we would say no. Sorry, no. And we would explain here, saying something like this target is less. Hard for me to talk and type at the same time. This target is less than the 100 intersections per square kilometre required. Could be the explanation for why it actually is not consistent with that, that threshold. I'm going to stop my examples there and come back to just quickly looking at our final steps, and then perhaps we can have quick Q&A. Is that all right, Deepti? So after you've fully completed the policy checklist, then the final steps are to work with us, the 1000 Cities Challenge team, to do some validation of the checklist, just to check for any errors. And also we will have a process whereby we can check with people local to your city about whether the information is as accurate as possible. And once we know that that is the case, the final step is to generate a scorecard and report for your city to get your city included in the Global Observatory, but also so you can use that report for your own purposes locally. And the report and scorecard templates are currently being updated for the 1000 Cities Challenge. These are the current ones, but they provide a visual sort of snapshot of the policy strengths and limitations for your city. And the policy report, the city report is a longer document that offers some comparisons with other places internationally. And the infographic scorecard is a single-page scorecard that can show and really highlight those areas of policy strength and limitations. So over to you, Deepti, for a bit of Q&A.
Sure, thanks, Melanie. That was a very detailed overview. So I've been monitoring the chat. I'll start right at the top. There was a question from Luca and talking about this. There's a lot of information on the municipal website. And in thinking about talking with the municipality, the policies may change in the next few months due to recent municipal elections. Should this be taken into account? So I think that also ties into the previous question about, when a policy is in draft form. I think the best case scenario in this would be to wait and see how the policies are implemented before maybe doing the data entry, because we want to assess whether the policies have actually been implemented. Isn't that right, Melanie?
Yeah, so I suppose, if they haven't been, just stop sharing there, if that's okay. Yeah. So I think it's very common that with a change of government, the policies change. So if you've just had a change of government and you suspect that there's going to be a change of policy, I think you can still assess the old, the previous government's policies. That's fine. But if you actually know that, a new policy is about to be adopted, or that the previous government has explicitly said that the previous government's policies are not relevant anymore, we're not going to be implementing them, that would seem to be a situation where it's not so relevant to assess the previous government policies. And that might be a situation where if you've got the time to wait, you might just wait a few months until you've got more clarity on it. But this is where we're also aware that every city is different. The political context is so diverse. And that's why we're here to help you. So if you've got these sorts of questions that are really specific to your context, drop us an email. We can brainstorm with you about what is the best approach in terms of timing and levels of government, how to work out whether a document is current or not.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. And we have some suggestions and tips from Dylan and Carl on how to conduct searches, what synonyms to use, how to review appendices, and those are quite useful. We have one question regarding the utilization of max QDA for content analysis in order to report on the frequency and percentage of related policies. And Mohammed, thanks for that. You've included an extra section in your checklist specifically for this. And your question is whether or not this extra work is necessary, given that we already have scores for each area. So I think we will, yeah, I'm not entirely clear on that, because we are going to analyze the frequency and percentage within the data you provide anyway.
Yeah, so Mohammed, I'm not exactly clear either on the question. So you're saying you're using max QDA for content analysis. I suppose really what we're talking about here is a content analysis of policies that are guided by our particular tool, this checklist. But of course, there's lots of other ways that you can do content analysis of policies. So this is an open access tool that you can download and use. And I suppose the added benefit is that you become part of this kind of global collaboration and the opportunity to have your city up there on the global observatory with international comparisons. But if you've got other ways that you actually kind of doing content analysis, does that help to answer your question? And then we've got a question there about local validation.
Yeah, and I see Carl has also responded. Thank you, Carl. How can I work with the local validation team, and when will the scorecard folder be available? So as Carl mentions, our membership director, Eugen, can help put you in touch with the local partners, and that's a good way to start. And I think by scorecard folder, you mean when you will get to see the final output. That takes a bit of time. As you can see, we have a 4-step process where we ask you to enter data, and then we go through the various processes of analysis. So down the road, you will be able to see the scorecard for your city, but that involves completing steps 1 through 4.
Yeah, and look, the only last thing I was going to add in terms of the validation processes, you're actually correct that there's not the full details about how that will be undertaken on the website yet. And we may well, once we finalise that process, have additional training and resources uploaded to the website. But at its heart, the validation process will be, you submitting the checklist to the 1,000 Cities Challenge team. It's an opportunity for us to generate a summary report of the information you've inputted. We can check for errors, but also just to do that local face validity checking, we will ask for contact details of some people located in your city or country who can help us to just validate, yes, we haven't missed anything, that seems reasonable, that assessment seems about right. This is a validation step that's really important before we kind of post up saying this is the official analysis for your city, if that makes sense. And just in terms of upcoming training that might be available or resources, it is really important that you sign up to the 1,000 Cities Challenge, and Deepti can go through this now, but on your screen now is the way that you actually sign up to our membership list, so that if there's more details posted in future, you're up to speed.
Yeah, and we have one question on looking through the policy checklist, and there aren't any principles for people with disabilities, and should it also be included in the checklist? So I think the indicators that we have established, you're welcome to add detail under each indicator about any attention to people with disabilities that is given in your policy. But that's a very important point. And thank you for highlighting that. We welcome that input into any of the indicators as you find relevant information.
And this is an ongoing project. Currently, yes, we don't collect information on particular population subgroups in any detail. You can enter those details, as Deepti has said, where it's relevant to your city policy context. But if there's new indicators that we need to add that target the particular needs of different groups in our society, we are very open to those conversations about adding new measures. And so make sure you get in touch with us if that's something of interest. I'm just aware of time. We probably should wrap up, unfortunately.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for joining. On the screen, you see a QR code, which if you're interested in staying up to date with the 1,000 Cities Challenge, we send out regular emails and alerts. So you're welcome to sign up. Also on our website, you'll find the link to sign up. And that's our contact information for Melanie and myself up on the screen. So thank you so much for joining us, and feel free to reach out to us with any other questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks very much, Deepti, for co-hosting the session, and everyone for your participation. Thanks again to the 1,000 Cities Challenge team behind the scenes. Yes, please do feel free to share the information about this challenge amongst your networks. And if any questions come up as you are proceeding with your analysis, make sure you do get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you.